to realize our need for God, to make time to spend alone time with Him, that we wouldn't need a priest or a preacher because God gave us a Savior, that gave us access to a Father, that when we submit to a process, not of our making, but of His, we can be initiated as men into true masculinity, that we can be led by Him so we learn how to lead, that we can be loved by Him so we learn how to love. This is Ponds and Beavers. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Let's dive into it. Let's dive in. Let's go deep. So I took a trip to Israel years back, and I met this man named Ari. I think I said his name right. Who was our tour guide, and he told us about how in the Jewish culture, shepherds would often meet with other shepherds, and they would come together and would hang out. You know, it was a social thing, but then they would share supplies but it was a community of shepherds. They would get together and their flocks they would kind of let them just graze. When Ari told us about all this, everyone's first thought was, how did the sheep not get mixed up, And yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking right now about like the chaos and, having 3 kids, 3 babies, and just, animals, having a dog, when the dog doesn't listen. I mean, imagine hundreds of sheep per shepherd. So you're talking hundreds of sheep, maybe even possibly thousands. And, how do they not get mixed up? So Ari told us, the sheep know the shepherd's voice. And so the shepherds would call their sheep. They would have a unique call, or they would, whatever they had that was unique to them, their voice, their tone, the sound they used, because the shepherds would talk to the sheep also. They would sing to the sheep. So the sheep knew the shepherds' voices, and they would all disperse and go back to each to their own shepherd, knowing their shepherd's voice. Now, of course, I can't help but think of John 10:27, when Jesus tells us, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. They know the shepherd's voice. Well, us. And if we are His sheep, wouldn't we know His voice, God's voice? We all know that God speaks. We all know that He speaks in all sorts of ways. And why wouldn't He? He's God. He can speak however He deems necessary. But how about us? Are we hearing? And more than just hearing, are we responding? Right? The whole difference between hearing and listening. You can hear, but listening's different, right? You can hear someone talk, but if you don't acknowledge what they're saying and respond in some way, right? It's almost as if they're not talking at all. Almost as if what we say, that God just isn't speaking to me. Well, when we don't acknowledge that it's God speaking, that's so powerful. Our belief is so powerful. Our choices are so powerful that it almost makes it as if God is not speaking, but He is. God showed me this kind of funny example of Bumblebee from Transformers and how his voice box was broken, right? And so he couldn't speak normal like everyone else, and he had to speak in like the radio stations in I think movie clips, and that's how he had to speak. He couldn't speak any other way. And here's the thing. So when God speaks to us, it may not be in a specific way that we're thinking it might be. So for instance, like in the example of Bumblebee and Transformers, whatever's available, he was using basically as a frequency, literally to communicate, right? And that's how God works with us. Whatever's in our minds and our hearts, right? Whether it's a voice or pictures or places, experiences that we have, right? What's happening right now or from our past, it's all like a modge podge of what God can use to speak to us in a way we will understand what he's saying. So, I think about how God would show Paul these visions and all this stuff. But what's crazy is it wasn't recorded that Paul saw a bunch of cars driving around and saw a bunch of tall skyscrapers and airplanes in the sky and helicopters. And whenever there was wars breaking out, he didn't see machine guns no, and I don't know. I mean, I guess, again, we can't limit God and what he can show us, but because he can show us things of the future, but we're not going to understand. And I think that's what stumped Paul when Paul began to see things, especially in Revelation, that he says he almost can't even put into words, because most of what God was showing him was stuff that he could at least put into words, at least understand. But that is an example of why God does what he does, how he speaks to us and communicates to us like he does. It's in a way we'll understand. Why wouldn't he speak to us in a way we would understand, right? Thing is, we tend to put God in a box, right? We tend to limit God in all sorts of ways, but I would say the main, most important and most impactful really in our life and in our walk with him, way we limit really ourselves, but we limit God as well, including ourselves in us and God in relationship, is we limit him in communication. We limit how he can speak to us, because we're not acknowledging certain ways, right? But if we can set aside the Morse code ways that we've limited him and the mail pigeons, bringing us mail in these old-fashioned ways, then we can hear him in the ways he wants to speak all the time to us. So, what is that? Well, I don't know. Whatever that is, fill in the blank. Whatever it is in your life. It could be a movie. It could be a moment with family or friends. It could be watching your kids play, and through watching them play, he speaks to you about something. It could be, sitting there observing the landscape. It could be watching some birds fly down on a lake. On your porch, watching the sunset, working out, spending time trail running or biking down a path. He can speak to us wherever, whenever, however he wants. He wants to use everything and anything, because mainly he wants to communicate, right? We're the ones that kind of make it this whole thing, make it this complicated thing, but to him, he just wants to talk to us. He wants to communicate. He wants to help us, right? He wants to help us. And I remember there was a time period, I really don't like running, but there was a time period where I actually found pleasure in running and going jogging like a few times a week. And man, I remember that still to this day. That was a really awesome way that again, God using what I'm giving him. Jogging. I want to go jogging. Well, all right, son, you're going to go jogging? Well, I'll use that to speak to you. And man, he would speak to me in so many different things. And some of it didn't have anything to do with jogging. Some of it did. Some of it would be this, using this challenging moment where I'm having to kind of get over something weird in my body, or, a pain, or whatever it is. Or I wanted to go another mile, and he used that to kind of speak something to me. I mean, he can use anything. Driving down the road's another one, at least for me personally, that God consistently uses, because I think we all can relate to the fact that we spend a lot of our days or days in the week, time every day driving at some point. And man, he really does use that as a more of a time period. But see, now we're getting into some depths here of, okay, you've got ways he can communicate to you, but now we're getting into the depths of the where, right? And so not just the when, but the where, and we're talking about the how, right? So there's different parts to this, but again, the bottom line is he wants to communicate to us, right? It's typically when we aren't thinking about a ton of stuff, that's when That's when it's easier to talk to us, right? When we're only focused on just one thing. That's why whenever, I'd go running or jogging, or, now I go to a journal, and I'll sit there and I'll just spend some time writing in a journal, or typing, but I'm journaling and I'm focused on just one thing. I'm sitting down, compartmentalized into everything is compartmentalized, and I'm able to focus on one specific thing. And for a lot of guys, that might help. So I'd encourage you to explore that with God. But again, first, I do want to say I love how practically God is, right, when it comes to relationship with us, but what that relationship entails. Communication being, again, the number one thing. I just did a thing on communication and intimacy. Well, communication breeds intimacy, basically. And so how important communication is in relationship, right? He wants to communicate to us, and I love how practical he is, how he meets us where we're at. He doesn't just, expect us to meet a certain standard, almost like we assume in our heads that the way he thinks, like a religious mindset, rules and laws of, rules, and if we don't abide by this, then we miss it. Oh, sorry, bud, you missed your chance today. It's like, no, that's not how he works. And he wants to communicate to us. And if we can just believe that one truth, that he wants to communicate to us, I think we would stop assuming that it's not him, right? We call it something told us to do this. Oh, man, I had this feeling that this would happen. All right, something told me not to, but I didn't. That whole something. If we can just stop assuming that it's not God, and maybe just start assuming that it's God, that would lead us down a path of freedom, so we can not only acknowledge him in our life. Imagine how that would feel if somebody didn't acknowledge every time you talk to them, and you were trying to convince them constantly that it was you. Imagine that. Well, let me see your driver's license. Well, let me look in your eyes really deep to make sure, I don't know, you're not a robot or an AI. Imagine that. Imagine how that would drive anyone insane. But God is so patient with us. He's patient. He endures our unbelief. He endures our doubt and our fear. And he approaches us with love, but with understanding. God knows how hard it is for us to believe that it's him, that it's not just us coming up with all this stuff in our heads, but that it's truly him speaking to us, right? Think about this too, because I've thought of this. God has shown me and reminded me of this, to remember all the times that I've prayed, God, please speak to me. God, please speak. Countless times. I could never count how many times I have prayed that prayer, or I've asked that of God. God, would you speak to me? Aside from the fact that he's probably sitting there thinking, well, son, I'm speaking to you all the time. You just aren't acknowledged. Okay, but if I'm praying that prayer though, and then I'm gonna go and act like God's the kind of God that's not gonna go and answer that prayer and answer it with doing what I'm asking him to do. We should really be questioning that, instead of questioning whether it's God speaking to us or not. We probably waste so much time doing that, but rather than doing that, assuming that it's him, thanking God that he's speaking to us. Hey, son, take a right turn. Okay, I'm just gonna take a right turn. God, I'm gonna trust it was you. I'm gonna assume it's you telling me to take a right turn. Imagine if we lived that way. Imagine that we would live a life of, when we come back from a men's retreat or a really good church service, like that could be how we live almost every day, rather than it being once a week or once a year. Right? When we have these highs with God, and then somehow we forget how real God is, and then we start treating God as if he's not as real as he is, as if he is a once a week God or a once a year God, right? And this message is for me just as well. And I might know this stuff, and you might know this stuff already, but man, we all need to be reminded, though, constantly about these things, because the problem is we do forget. The problem is we do get discouraged. Life does run us down. Those voices convince us otherwise, that God isn't as real as we know he is, and we start questioning, that's probably not God, it's probably just, no, we can't do that. Just like Jesus promises to us that his sheep hear a shepherd's voice. Let's just say that as a fact, right? What Ari was explaining to us, ignorant Americans, as he's given us all these tours and stuff, he's explaining in the Jewish culture specifically how the sheep would literally know and recognize the voice of the shepherd. And Jesus promises that we, being his sheep, we will hear and know his voice, recognize his voice, right? That's powerful, and that's freedom. That's freedom that we were meant to live in every day of our life. So, just like every time before, I do want to give y'all a time, and me, myself included, a time to just take all of this to God and spend some time alone with God. I hate to say practice, because this should be just who we are and just part of relationship, but it does take practice to learn. So let's practice and learn together what it's like to engage in acknowledging God's voice. And let's do that right now. So spend some time with him right now.